By August, Victor Hale's vineyard was turning brown from the roots upward. White salt surrounded every irrigation emitter, leaves curled beneath the New Mexico sun, and entire rows stopped carrying water. Across the boundary fence, however, one narrow strip remained green. 15-year-old Caleb Ross cut open the lower stem of one surviving vine. Beneath the cultivated green wood was a dark purple rootstock that had remained alive in the same poisoned soil. Only months earlier, Victor had laughed when Caleb spent $5,000 on White Mesa Vineyard, a 32-acre property that had already bankrupted 3 adult owners. The well produced salty water, the pump had failed, hundreds of vines were dead, and the soil carried a pale mineral crust. If you enjoy stories about abandoned farms and forgotten ideas that return when people need them most, subscribe and join us. Caleb had bought the vineyard using money earned repairing irrigation lines and helping during harvest. His family believed he was protecting the last unfinished experiment of his grandfather, Tomas Ross. Inside Tomas's notebooks, Caleb had found one repeated phrase, "Coyote Purple," not for wine, but for roots. The notes described a wild grapevine growing in a ravine where salty water collected. Its fruit was nearly useless, but its roots survived conditions that killed cultivated grapes. Caleb did not know whether the idea would work. He only knew the worst vineyard in the valley was the one place nobody else wanted badly enough to stop him from trying. Caleb followed his grandfather's hand-drawn map into the eroded channel south of White Mesa. Among mesquite, loose stone, and white mineral deposits, he found several wild vines with dark purple young wood. Their leaves were small and leathery. Their berries were almost black, but so sour that no winery would buy them. Caleb collected only a few cuttings from each plant and labeled every line separately. He wanted roots, not fruit. The first attempt nearly destroyed the project. Several cuttings rotted because the propagation soil stayed too wet. Others dried before forming roots. Of the plants that survived, Caleb grafted 40 with cultivated wine grapes. He worked too late in the season. The summer heat dried many grafts before the tissues joined. On the second group, he wrapped the tape too tightly. The vines began growing, but a windstorm snapped several at the weakened unions. Only 5 grafted plants survived. Victor showed the broken vines to his workers as proof that the boy had tied good grapes to useless weeds. Caleb studied the failures instead of hiding them. The purple roots remained alive even where the cultivated tops had died. That meant his grandfather's idea had not failed completely. The following spring, Caleb grafted earlier, shaded the unions, and loosened the wrapping as the plants expanded. This time, enough vines survived to form several short experimental rows. The new vines looked unusual. Their lower trunks were dark reddish purple, while the cultivated growth above the graft remained bright green. Some plants grew strongly, others stayed short. Several combinations failed, even though the rootstock itself survived. Caleb recorded every result. One purple line worked well with a local red grape, but weakened a white variety. Another produced healthy leaves but very small clusters. A third grew slowly during spring and accelerated only when the soil became hot. After 2 seasons, the first normal grapes appeared. The fruit tasted like the cultivated varieties grafted above the purple roots. The wild rootstock did not ruin the flavor, but the harvest was too small to fill even the smallest fermentation tank. White Mesa was finally producing grapes, yet it still could not pay its taxes. Caleb planted conventional vines beside every purple-rooted line and gave them the same water. At first, the difference was small. Then, brown edges appeared on the leaves of the ordinary vines. The purple-rooted plants remained green longer. Caleb sent samples to a university laboratory, but the researchers said the experiment was too limited for conclusions. Victor offered to buy part of White Mesa for equipment storage. Caleb refused because selling the comparison ground would destroy the value of his test. He continued planting, grafting, measuring, and losing vines. By the 3rd season, several hundred experimental plants covered the property. Then wells across the valley began producing water that was saltier than before. The damage appeared slowly. Victor's leaves developed brown margins. Young clusters stopped growing. White deposits thickened around irrigation lines. Farmers applied more water, briefly improving the plants while adding even more salt to the soil. Then a record heat wave crossed the valley. Vines, already weakened by salinity, could no longer cool themselves. Fruit shriveled, leaves fell, and young blocks died row by row. White Mesa also suffered. One coyote purple family failed almost completely. Several grafts remained alive below the union but could no longer support the cultivated vines above them. Caleb marked every loss and removed those lines from future propagation. Other purple-rooted vines survived. Their leaves showed damage, but they continued moving water while the conventional comparison plants collapsed. Dr. Elena Marquez, a grapevine specialist from a New Mexico university, arrived with a research team. They tested roots, leaves, water, and soil from the experimental rows. The results showed that coyote purple was not one uniform solution. It was a collection of different wild lines. Some restricted sodium and chloride from reaching the leaves. Others formed deeper roots in cooler soil. A few survived salt but reduced the crop too much to be useful. The diversity was the discovery. Caleb had not found one miraculous vine. He had found several possible root systems for different soils and grape varieties. A national nursery offered to buy exclusive control of every line. Caleb refused. Caleb created a regional testing program with the university and several local vineyards. Each grower received more than one coyote purple line. They recorded water salinity, graft compatibility, yield, and leaf damage. Failed combinations were reported as carefully as successful ones. Victor joined after losing much of his southern vineyard. His first trial was uneven. One rootstock worked with his red grapes, another produced weak unions, and a third survived the salt but delivered too little fruit. The program expanded slowly. Nurseries began selling approved purple-rooted plants for vineyards facing saline water. White Mesa became a propagation farm rather than a large wine producer. Income came from rooted cuttings, grafted vines, nursery licenses, research contracts, and limited bottles made from the first surviving rows. Over several years, the value of the nursery and its agreements grew into millions. Caleb never described the rootstock as a cure. Extreme salinity could still kill it. Some grape varieties remained incompatible. The vineyard required careful irrigation, drainage, and constant testing. Years after the auction, Caleb stood with Victor between two vines that looked almost identical above ground. One was green, the other carried brown salt burns. The difference was hidden beneath the soil. The vineyard no man could save became valuable, not because Caleb forced the old land to support the same roots again. He gave the grapes different roots and allowed the valley to discover which ones still belonged there.